Hey everybody, and welcome to our first official video for Psych 101. The previous video that I had that I already posted online is really just kind of a way to kind of get us interested in the class and to let you know a little bit about what we're going to be covering this semester. This video is kind of our first real foray into the subject material. So this is kind of where exam one starts, right? So we're at the very, very beginning here. Thank you so much for being here. What we're going to be doing today is talking mostly about what psychology is, what kind of questions does it ask and attempt to answer, and then a little bit about the history of psychology and a look at where we are now. Now, with all that being said, this is not going to be anybody's favorite chapter, I'm sorry to say. At the end of the semester, usually I like to ask folks, what was your favorite chapter? What chapter interested you most? Which chapter do you feel like you wish you could have learned more? Chapter 1 is never one of those chapters, and I think it's because a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of this material maybe you've seen before, especially if you've taken psychology in high school. But I think the other part of it is that people don't really like the history part, and I totally understand why, because a lot of times history just feels like a thing of the past that is just a bunch of facts to memorize, and it doesn't really, it's important to know, but it doesn't really affect us, right? But I think that and I felt that way too, by the way, whenever I took this class, whenever I was an undergraduate. But I think that in the time since, having thought a lot about this class and a lot about psychology as a discipline, I think that it is actually really important to know where it came from. Most times when people think of the history of psychology, they think of Freud, right? And we will talk about Freud, but this is maybe one of 2 or 3 chapters that we talk about Freud. He's not really that, that prominent a figure like I feel like pop culture kind of represents that he is in psychology. Anyways, that's enough kind of monologuing. Let's get right into it. So psychology is about everybody. It's about me, it's about you, it's about your brother and sister, your friends, it's about people. And I think that for that reason, that might be one of the reasons why you signed up for this class, right? Is because psychology deals with people, and you know that you're going to be working with people after you graduate, so maybe it's helpful to know about psychology. So psychology is one of the most popular majors across the university system in the United States. I think here at Westfield, we usually kind of compete for the top 3 or 4. We're not actually the biggest major on campus, and we're not the second biggest major. I think that those awards go to criminal justice and education, but I could be wrong about that. But one of the reasons why it is often very popular is because it is personally relevant, and because it is personally relevant to us, but it's also relevant to other people too, because this is the science of how people work, essentially, why people behave the way they do. A lot of people are usually interested in understanding why people behave the way that they do, right? Especially whenever you're growing up and you don't always know why did that person say this to me? Why did this person not hold open the door for me? Was it something that I did? Did I come across weird? Did my email, was it, not nice enough? Understanding why people do the things that they do is usually one of the top things when I ask a psychology class, why do you want to be a psych major? A big answer for why is that they want to understand people. They want to know, why do people do the things that they do? And that is what psychology is all about. Psychology is all about the study of the mind, the brain, and our behavior. And you don't have to answer this now, but I want you to be thinking about this as the semester goes on. Are these 3 concepts different? And if they are, in what ways would you say that they are different? So how is the mind different from the brain? And how is the brain different from behavior? In other words, maybe another way to kind of get at this question is, do you think that the mind and brain are separate? Do you think that the mind and behavior are separate? Do you think that the brain and the mind are separate, and the brain and behavior? There's a lot of kind of fuzzy boundaries for where these things end and where they begin. Personally, for me speaking, I actually don't really see too big a difference between these things, right? That basically whenever we behave a certain way, that is going to impact the brain and the brain's development and how it's wired. And if you were to mess with somebody's brain, that will affect the way that they behave, right? So it's not unidirectional. It's not like the brain just tells us what to do. that our behavior affects the brain. So we could even think about it like our behavior tells the brain what to do. But I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little bit too philosophical because we could argue about this stuff all semester pretty much. But I just wanted to kind of give you my perspective on this, is that these kind of categories of the mind, the brain, and the behavior are really kind of fuzzy, that they kind of overlap into one another in interesting ways. And I think as a psychologist, one of the most fascinating things is to see what ways they don't relate to each other, because that can tell us a lot about why we do what we do. All right, so the goals of any science are to do really three things. One is to predict the subject matter, to describe the subject matter, and to explain the subject matter. And that's true for psychology too. The book kind of just puts this into a very strict kind of two-category system of predict and describe. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to not only kind of describe what it is that people are doing whenever they are behaving, we're also trying to explain what it is too. We're also trying to think about, well, why did they do what they do? What is, the behavior that allowed that to happen? What is the mindset that allowed that to happen? And in so doing that, then we might also be able to predict what people are going to do. And I know that's not easy. I have a PhD in psychology, and I can't predict what every single person is going to do. But you can get a pretty good guess about what people are going to be doing if you know something about psychology. So the goals of psychology, we want to understand mental activity, we want to understand social interactions, we want to understand how people acquire behavior. There are lots of different things that we could look at, which is part of what this chapter is all about. What are the types of questions that we could be asking about behavior? So what do these three things mean? And this is kind of the way that the book treats this, is that the mind includes mental activity, it includes perception, it includes thought, it includes memories, and it includes feelings. In other words, a lot of this is kind of a word that you don't really see all that much in Psych 101, but the word covert. So these are covert behaviors. You thinking, you perceiving something, you having a memory, those are things that I can't really see you do. I can't see you remember something. I can't see you think something. I can't see you perceive something. I might be able to tell the side effects of you perceiving something. If you put your hand on a hot stove, I can tell that maybe it hurts because you recoil and you pull your hand away. But whenever you do that, when you're pulling your hand away, then what we're doing is we're talking about your behavior. We're talking about the observable actions that I can outwardly see and observe and measure and empirically report. So behaviors are kind of those outward observable actions. We're going to call those overt behaviors. And then finally we have the brain, which is the biological part here. And so we're talking here about kind of like the biological processes that allow these two to interact with one another, the mind and the brain, the mind and behavior. Here is a nice little kind of flow chart of this. So we got thoughts that will impact our emotions will impact our behaviors, and our behaviors will impact our thoughts. But you'll also see that the reverse is also true. Let me give you an example of this instead of talking in abstracts. So let's say that, let me erase this for a second. Let's say that I am feeling very, very depressed, right? If I'm feeling depressed, so that's my emotion. So I'm feeling depressed. That is going to impact what I do. That's going to impact my behaviors. I'm probably not going to get out of bed. I'm probably not going to feel like I want to do the things that I normally love to do. Like if I loved playing video games, now I don't love playing video games. I don't feel like doing it. So it affects my behavior, that depression does. That behavior, the things that I do, not playing my favorite thing, or not doing my favorite activities, not hanging out with my friends, not getting out of my bed, is going to affect my thought process. So now I'm going to start thinking like, wow, I haven't done anything all day. I must be worthless, right? I must have no value. And those kinds of thoughts are going to impact my emotion. It's going to make me a little bit more depressed because I am thinking about how I'm not doing the things that I used to love to do. But we can also see how this can kind of work in reverse, that it's not just a one-way street here. So let's say if I am depressed, or actually, hold on, let's start somewhere else actually. Let's start with that maybe I have some recurring thoughts that for some reason I can't get out of my head that I'm worthless, that I feel like I don't belong here at the university, that I feel like I don't belong. I'm a first-generation student and I feel like I'm an imposter, that I don't belong here, that other people are or more deserving than me to be there. It's a very common thought for students. That's a thought that I had whenever I was a first-generation student sitting where you are right now. So maybe you feel like you're a little bit worthless, and so what happens when we feel that way? Well, for a lot of people, they're going to start behaving like they are thinking. So if they feel like they're worthless, they feel like they don't belong here, maybe they're going to stop showing up to class, right? They're going to stop attending class, they're going to stop doing their schoolwork because they feel like it doesn't really matter because they don't belong there. And what are those behaviors going to do? Those behaviors, they're not going to make you feel good. They're going to make you feel depressed. They're going to make you feel anxious. They're going to make you feel stressed. And so how are those emotions going to affect your thought process? They're only going to reinforce that. So our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, they all kind of influence one another, just like the mind, the brain, and behavior influence one another. And so we can talk about things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which we'll talk about in the very, very end of the semester, about how certain therapies are designed to perhaps target the thoughts and the behaviors here, hoping that if we can change these, that these might change your emotions. But hey, that's therapy. If you've been in therapy before, maybe you know how it works, but if you haven't, then hey, I would recommend it. Give it a try. Even if you don't feel like you necessarily need to, it can be nice to just kind of release a little pressure valve and kind of get some things off your chest. All right, so to kind of give you a demonstration of how this works, here is an example of something that of psychology in action. So I'm going to read you a personality description that should match about 1 in 2 people out of 10. So that means about 10 to 20% of people should find that this personality description matches them. Because our class has about 20 people, that means about maybe 4 or 5 of you, if we're lucky, might feel this way. So here we go. Here are those characteristics. Let's say, are you somebody that you feel like you have a great need for other people to like and admire you? You have a great deal of unused capacity, which you have not turned to your advantage. You are disciplined and self-controlled on the outside, but you tend to be worrisome and insecure on the inside. You prefer a certain amount of change and variety and become dissatisfied when hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. You pride yourself as an independent thinker and do not accept others' statements without satisfactory proof. Sorry, I needed an apostrophe there. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. At times, you have serious doubts as to whether you have made the right decision or the right thing, or done the right thing, At times, you're extroverted and sociable, while at other times, you're introverted, wary, and reserved. And while you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. Okay, so did you feel like I was speaking about your personality? If so, that is totally normal because probably most people that were listening and playing along felt like those statements applied to them. This is known as the Forer effect, sometimes known as the Barnum effect. I got to work on my I got to work on my handwriting this semester, y'all. This is embarrassing. I got my little stylus here. I'm not blaming the stylus. This is totally me. So this is the Forer effect, also known as the Barnum effect, and this is whenever you have statements that are vague, and because they are vague, people feel like they can apply to them. So this is used a lot in horoscopes. Actually, I know some of you love horoscopes, right? Because sometimes when people ask me what my birthday is and I say that it's in March, they're like, oh, you're an Aries. And I think horoscopes are a bunch of nonsense. Well, I think even the people who like horoscopes know that they're nonsense deep down. But sorry, I should not be making so many enemies right now. But I wanted to pull up my daily horoscope, for example, to show you what I mean here. What this says is, you discovered today that an acquaintance from your social life has suddenly become one of your most valuable and strategic business contacts. You should consider this person for possible career assistance. Okay, that is my horoscope for today. Let me look at that one more time. You discovered today that an acquaintance from your social life has suddenly become one of your most valuable and strategic business contacts. Okay, so what is my social life? Does that mean a family member? Does that mean a friend? Does that mean that somebody that I used to know on Facebook? Does that mean somebody on social media? Who knows? It's super vague, right? Because if you talk to anybody today, they could be part of your social life. they may suddenly become the most valuable and strategic business contacts. What does that mean? Does that mean that they are going to help you get a job? I don't know. Does that mean they're going to give you good business advice? I don't know. Does that mean that they are going to buy something from you? I don't know. It's totally vague, right? You should consider this person for possible career assistance. Okay, like what? Like, and hopefully you see what I mean here. And this is just one. This is the first example that I pulled up. You can check your horoscope right now, and I promise you, it is super vague, and you might get even some personality things where you say like, oh, and I know sometimes people right now are watching this and be like, oh, he's being very antagonistic. What an Aries move to pull. And that's exactly what I mean, is that those statements are so vague that they can apply to anybody in almost any circumstance, that they are not falsifiable. So that's the key there, is that you can't really falsify those things. If we look at some of these statements, for example, while you have some personality weaknesses, you're generally able to compensate for them. That's true for literally everybody, right? At times you're extroverted, sociable, while at other times you're introverted, wary, and reserved. So, hey, what do you know? Sometimes I like to hang out with friends, and sometimes I don't. At times you have serious doubts as to whether you've made the right decision or done the wrong thing. Bro, I had that same idea today when I made a smoothie, and I thought maybe I put in too many bananas, right? So, of course, everybody feels that way. So everybody's going to feel like that applies to them. Now, why does that matter? Because if I'm trying to extract money from you, if I'm trying to extract some kind of goodwill from you, then maybe I try to act like I know you, and I try to act like, hey, I know all these things about you, right? So you should buy my self-help course, or you should buy you should buy these clothes, or you should buy whatever. People are always trying to sell you stuff. So with horoscopes, with any kind of psychic readings, with any kind of social media quiz that you find online, some kind of, I don't know, like a TikTok trend that's like, oh my gosh, if you drink your coffee like this, it means that you are an extrovert. If you drink your coffee like this, it means you're an introvert. All of that stuff is just a bunch of baloney. And it's just the Forer effect in action. Now, some of you probably caught up on this as I was reading those descriptions. You wisened up immediately and you were like, wait a second, this is a psychology class, and in this video, how can he verify any of this stuff? This is probably BS. Nice job. I like that you're being skeptical. I'm a very skeptical person, if that's not clear already. And so maybe some of you are not super surprised by that. That's actually kind of a common thing in psychology, where people feel like it's just common sense. That people feel like things that we teach in psychology are obvious and common sense, and to that degree, I kind of agree with people on that. And the reason why is because, how old are you? 18, 19, 20, 30, 40? Doesn't matter. If you are 18 years old, you have been around people for 18 years. You've probably learned something about how they work and how they operate and how they behave. So we're all kind of experts in behavior already, right? We already kind of know how people work because we've been around them for so long, right? If I use a sarcastic attitude to answer every one of your questions, you're probably going to stop asking questions, right? I didn't need a PhD to be able to tell you that that was going to happen, right? You didn't either. So is that just common sense? I don't necessarily think that it is, but I do think that it is maybe familiar to us already because we have observed psychology all of our lives. So let me give you another example of maybe something that isn't super surprising. So let me pull this up. And you may remember last video, in the first welcome to class video, I showed you an awareness test, and in that awareness test, you were I fooled you with a moonwalking bear, right? So I already know, and maybe I do think that was surprising, but maybe you're not sold on that. Maybe you're like, oh, now I'm second guessing if I even showed you that video now. Doesn't matter. If not, I'll talk about it later this semester. But you already know that I'm trying to trick you, right? You know that I just gave you the Forer effect personality thing. I'm talking about how this stuff is maybe surprising, so you know I'm going to try to trick you. So what I want you to do is to watch this scene. It's less than 2 minutes long, and I want you to see if you can spot something strange about what happens here. It may be something somebody says, maybe something somebody does, or maybe something else.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away. It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Okay, cool, right? So probably almost every single one of you noticed something that changed, right? So as the camera was moving, things that were off screen sometimes changed. And usually, I've taught this class enough and shown this video enough that I know that usually people will remark on this. And it's partly because I said the moonwalking bear, right? I tried to get your attention over on the bear that was over in the corner there. Now you see that it is a knight, right? So that is the thing that changed. But there were actually 20 other things that changed in this video. This video will show you all the things that did change, and then we'll talk about this in just a moment.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
All right, and so this turned out to be, I kind of want to see this. Rude Karens get what they deserve. But this turns out to be a bicycle ad. But the reason why I wanted to show it here is because if I told you that I was going to show you a video and that you would maybe notice 2 or 3 things that changed in that video when in fact there were 20 of them that happened, you'd probably say like, yeah, right, I would probably notice that. But the truth is that most people only notice 1 or 2 things in that video that changes. So why is that? Everyone's eyes picked up the exact same information. Why did some of us totally miss out on these changes? We'll be talking about that later this semester. So the example that the book gives, which is another example that I love, is this case where participants were asked to hold a cup of hot coffee, and then the individual who asked them to hold the cup left the room. And then afterwards, those individuals who were holding the coffee were asked to rate the individual that handed them that coffee. They didn't realize that that's what this experiment was going to be, but that's what it is how, tell me about the person that made you hold their coffee. And what happened is that those that were given the warmer cup would rate that individual as being more charitable, less selfish, more warm and kind and caring and honest than someone who handed an iced coffee to that same individual. So the people that handed the iced coffee were described as being, of course you would guess, cold, but also less trustworthy, more selfish, more extravagant, more stingy with their money, less charitable. So why is that? And that's a surprise, right? You wouldn't expect that if I gave you a cup of hot coffee that would change your feelings about me, right? That doesn't seem super obvious. So even though a lot of psychology can seem to be a little obvious, I think there's a lot that will surprise you about human behavior. All right. When we're talking about how we can analyze human behavior, it really falls under 4 different levels of analysis. We have the biological level of analysis, the individual level of analysis, the social level of analysis, and the cultural level of analysis. The book will go into more detail about these things, but if I want to give you a quick example of each of these things, let's go through the example of listening to music. If you want to study listening to music, which for psych majors that take research methods, a lot of people like making experiments where they have their participants listen to music and then do something, like listen to music while they're studying or listening to music while they're doing a Jenga tower or something like that to see if it affects their behavior. So maybe this is something that you would be interested in. So if we were examining listening to music on a biological level, then we might say that, okay, what does listening to music do to the brain when we're listening to classical music versus techno music or some electronic dance music? That's a biological question. We can also look at the individual level of analysis, which could be as easy as how much music do you listen to from week to week, and is that associated with how much you sleep at night? That's an example of individual level. I'm focusing on one individual person. I can also look at a social level of analysis where I can see how other people might influence how we listen to music. So, for example, you're riding with your bestie, and she gives you the aux cord, which I don't think we even have aux cords anymore, but she gives you Spotify and lets you put on whatever you want. Are you going to put on really whatever you want, or are you going to put on something that you think you would both enjoy and both not argue over? Or maybe you're trying to impress her. Maybe you're trying to show her something she hasn't seen before. But again, that might be different than if you were writing solo and picking something up on Spotify. And then we can also look at the cultural level of this, and this is where we kind of get a little bit closer to sociology, where I could say, like, what does listening to electronic dance music tell us about how you perceive yourself, how you relate to other people, where we think about things at kind of a more cultural level. All right, so a lot of professions require some baseline understanding of psychology, and you can probably rattle a couple of these off your heads, and I don't mean like counselor or psychiatrist or psychologist, things like that. I mean like a teacher, for example. A teacher absolutely needs to know about psychology, right? If a kid is acting out in class, if they're being mean, if they're being a bully, you need to know how to handle that. You need to know, well, why are they being a bully? So that way I can nip this in the bud and get them to stop being a bully. Lawyers need to know human behavior because they need to know how to convince people, how to be persuasive, how to be empathetic to your client and understand their case and things like that. Doctors, obviously, if you want to have good bedside manner, you need to know how to treat patients with respect and with dignity and let them feel understood, let them feel like you know what you're talking about. Those are all things that psychology can help with. Even engineers. So engineers, you can... I have some friends that are engineers, and their entire day they work from home. They see people over Zoom, and that's pretty much it. They don't really have a whole lot of human contact, so why would they need to know about psychology? Well, ask yourself, like, if you've ever played a game on your phone or used an app or used a phone, used any device, and you thought to yourself, like, this is confusing. That's an example of maybe that engineer would have benefited from understanding how people are going to approach their device, approach their app, and maybe they can make their software more intuitive. That's one of the big things that Apple contributed to the market to whenever they introduced the iPhone, is not that the iPhone was the very first device you could put in the palm of your hand and use like a mini computer. Those already existed, but it was one of the first to really do it in an intuitive way that you didn't need a stylus, that you could give to your grandma or grandpa and they could kind of pick it up and kind of understand it. Nurses, obviously, for the same reason as doctors. Business managers, you need to know how to keep morale up. You need to know how to get the most out of your employees and things like that. All right, so now is a good time to pause the video if you need a little bit of a break. We're at the 30-minute mark here, and we're about halfway through, I would say. So grab yourself a root beer or whatever. You go use the restroom or whatever. Pause the video, come back, and then we'll finish this up. All right, so some of you were like, nah, I'm going to binge this. I'm just going to keep going, and I respect it. For those of you that took a step back from now, welcome back. So let's talk a little bit about history and context. And one of the biggest kind of themes in this class, and indeed in this major, is that context matters. I would say that's maybe the biggest lesson of this class, is that context matters. If I were to ask you, what is your favorite, what is your favorite music? What kind of music is your favorite? That's a really tough question, and it really depends, right? So, like, it depends on if you're studying, it depends on if you're driving, it depends on if you're walking the dogs, it depends on if you are at the club, it depends on if you're fishing. It depends on if you are working out. It depends on if you are trying to go to sleep. All of these things can impact your choice there, right? And that's because context matters. It's because it depends. And that phrase, actually, it depends. Probably my most the two words that I've used the most in my teaching career as a psychologist is that it depends, because it all does depend on context. Are you a nice person? It depends, right? It depends on if somebody just punched you in the face. Are you a nice person then? So much of why we do the things that we do is it depends. And while that might be frustrating, I think it also emphasizes how much variation there is in each individual one of us, that we don't always behave the same way, and that it can help by knowing the context so that I can know how you're going to behave. So let me give you an example here. So right now I'm thinking about food, and if I were to go ask my spouse, hey, what do you want for dinner? I have no idea what she's going to say, though, right? I have no idea. I could guess. But if I know something about the context of her day, or the context of what time of day it is, I might be able to guess what she might want to eat. If it's a little bit later in the day, she might say, let's go get something fast from town, right? Because I don't want to have to wait on, to cook something. Or I had a really hard day, I'm not in the mood for either of us to cook. That's an example of how context can change how you respond to a very simple question that you get every single day. So we all have biases, we all have ways that we react differently to our circumstances around us, and science is really no different. And also, by the way, this word bias is kind of a loaded term, I know, because like in pop culture, bias usually means something bad, right? If somebody has a bias against you, that's usually a bad thing for you, right? It means that somebody doesn't like you for some reason. But bias really, that's all that it means, is that it means that there is a slight preference, that there's a slight difference to the kind of response that you would expect. So, for example, my bias is that I'm an optimist. I tend to look on the bright side, I tend to be hopeful, I tend to overestimate things, and that's because I'm an optimist. That means that I'm biased, right? So if you were to ask me, how long is this video going to take? I'm going to say an hour because I'm an optimist, even though now I'm starting to realize, like, oh man, this might actually take a little bit longer than an hour. But the reason why I say an hour is because I thought I'd be able to get through it on time. That is my bias. And science is really not different than that. The scientific method is unbiased. But sciences themselves are generally not biased. We see this a lot. Like, for example, let's say that some guy who never took Psych 101, never took a class in psychology, let's say that person wrote a book and said that they understood human behavior perfectly. The scientific community, psychologists as a whole, would see that person very skeptically, right? Because that person doesn't have a traditional psychology background. They didn't go through college. They didn't do any research on this stuff. And those are things that our science is kind of biased against, that we're a little bit skeptical about stuff that doesn't have research behind it, for example. So for this reason, it's helpful for us to know the context where psychology came from, so that way we can help understand not just where it's going, but what kinds of biases it has right now. So let's start by talking about how it is a competition of ideas. One of the things that we're going to see throughout this semester is that there are certain questions that come up again and again and again. One of them is, are the brain and the mind different, right? That's one that we've already talked about, right? That people might argue or debate over that question. So that's an example of one of the kind of competitions of ideas that we're now still working with as we use things like an MRI scanner to scan the brain to understand it. Maybe the one that you're most common with is this idea of nature versus nurture. You've probably heard this phrase before, but nature versus nurture is the idea that our behavior might be dictated by either our genetics and our parents and their DNA, or it could be because of the environment. The first of those is the nature. The second of those is the nurture. So what does that mean? Basically what we're saying here is that, let's say that, okay, here's an example that applies to me. I'm a very shy person. I'm a person that generally likes to, if it's a social setting, I like to hang out in the back. I don't like to be the center of attention. It's just not for me. My dad is also kind of the same way. So, is that because I inherited that part of my dad's personality? Or is that because I observed my dad behaving similarly growing up, and so now that's why I act that way? The first of those explanations is nature. The second of those explanations is nurture. The second question that we're going to see a lot this semester is about whether or not consciousness is measurable. This leads to the mind-body problem. Is the mind part of the body? People who say that consciousness is measurable will say yes, the mind and the body are the same, because the mind is a product of the brain and the brain is a product of the body. People who say no, that consciousness can't be reliably measured, think that the mind is something different than the brain. It's not just the electrical activation of the brain. It's not just brain activation. It's something different than that. Maybe it's a soul, maybe it's a spirit of some kind, but there's something more than just the brain activation there. And then finally, so those are questions you've probably heard, like before you took a psych class. But where we kind of begin in our history here is looking at this question about what's more important for us to know about behavior. Is it more important for us to know where our behaviors come from in our brain, or why they occur at all? And this is going to bring us to two schools of thought: the structuralist school and the functionalist school. All right, so let's take a look at. We're gonna tackle that in just a little bit, but let's address some of these other ones and review those before we do our little deep dive on history. So the nature versus nurture debate has been around for several hundred years, thousands of years by now. This notion of nature versus nurture, about whether or not who we are is destined and fated, or is it something that changes over time? Aristotle and Plato, you probably know those Greek dudes from your history classes or your philosophy classes. These philosophers, they disagreed on this, by the way. Plato was Aristotle's mentor, and they really disagreed on this. Plato thought that behavior was based on nature, that who you are right now, you were always going to be that way since the moment you were born. You may have been different before. Maybe you had a better sense of humor when you were a high schooler. Maybe you were more rebellious when you were a high schooler. But now, you are who. Like, if you could be reborn again, you'd be rebellious as a teenager, and you'd be exactly how you are now. Aristotle says, no, I don't believe that. I think actually we are who we are because of the things that have happened to us. So, is psychology innate, or is it environmental and cultural? The dominant view today is that, and I know this is one of those annoying things about how it depends, that these two things influence each other. That nature and nurture influence each other. In other words, that our genes, our DNA, is going to impact the choices that we make in the environment, and the environment is going to affect our behavior, and that in turn might affect what genes are activated or suppressed or dormant, I guess is the word I was looking for. So it's not as easy as one or the other. All the available research that we have tells us that it's both. That both of these things happen, and that sometimes, things can be more one than the other, but for the most part, they both happen. We'll talk about later this semester how we might test for this. It involves twin studies, where you have identical twins. You have identical twins, have them raised apart. That happens. It's very rare for that to happen, but it does happen in the cases of adoption, where sometimes you have identical twins that are raised separated, and then later they come together. They meet each other, and they find out how much they have in common. I have a video, I have a movie that I'll show you later this semester called 3 Identical Strangers. It's a great documentary. It's not old either. It just came out by now a few years ago. I wrote 3 documentaries, 3 Identical Strangers, and that movie tackles this question head on. Sorry, my handwriting is so bad, I'm going to take my time here. I'm just not very good at multitasking and writing, I guess. 3 Identical Strangers. In case you wanted to look it up, it might be on Netflix, it might be on Hulu. It makes the rounds like they all do. So we'll be looking at the nature versus nurture debate a lot this semester. The mind-body problem, kind of as we talked about, this is another one of those things where philosophers beat us to this by several hundred years. Psychology didn't really come around until the mid to late 1800s. So back in the 1600s, the early 1600s, René Descartes, this French nobleman, came up with this phrase, I think, therefore I am. You've probably heard it before. What did he mean by I think, therefore I am? Essentially what he was saying is that if I can think, then that must mean that I exist in some capacity. Maybe I'm just a brain in a jar hallucinating all of this. Maybe I'm just dreaming all of this. But the fact that I can think means that there is something about me that exists. So René Descartes felt like the world was dualistic. In other words, that we have a body, but that we also have a separate immaterial soul. That soul is something that drives our body. That we do what we do, we are who we are because of this soul that can't be measured or really understood in the realms of science. But today, most psychologists usually kind of approach this as monists. In other words, that they are not dualists. In other words, that the brain and the mind are subject to natural laws of physics and natural laws of reality. There's nothing supernatural about it. And so you can measure the mind because the mind isn't supernatural. If it were supernatural, then it couldn't be measured. So that's kind of the approach that a lot of these researchers that we're going to be learning about this year, how they are approaching this, where they are essentially saying that, hey, we know that the mind exists because we can scan a brain and we can see this activity, and we can see that whenever you're thinking about saying something, that part of your brain that is active when you're normally saying it is also activated by you thinking about saying it. So they believe that you can boil down consciousness into brain activation that is measurable, that you can detect using an MRI machine or an EEG or those other sophisticated devices. I'm not going to tell you to believe one or the other about these things, by the way. And you might even feel conflicted about these things, where you kind of believe a little bit of both, and that is totally okay. I'm just kind of letting you know where things stand right now. All right, so let's take a quick look at right before experimental psychology came to be, who was there first. And I think that if you were to ask who was the very first psychologist, I don't know, you're going to get a lot of different answers. I teach history and systems of psychology as like a senior level course. It's a course that is all about this question about like, where does psychology come from? Who are the notable people who developed it? What kind of biases does psychology have? And so I think a lot about this stuff. And the one name that comes up over and over and over again, not necessarily as the first, but let's say the first popular psychologist, that is going to be our boy Sigmund Freud. You know him, you've heard him before, you know he's a freak, you know he's weird, you've probably seen him before. He's got the best fits in the game. Look at this outfit, man. He's got this cool outfit, he's got a great beard, looks sophisticated, always got this cool look in his eye, like he's determined, and he's always got a stogie, he's always carrying around a cigar. He believed that human behavior, and by the way, he also started out as a physician. He started out as somebody who was in the realms of medicine, and ultimately he transitioned over into psychology. And so his background was actually medicine, which most people don't know. But he believed that human behavior was kind of this balance between mental processes that are beneath our consciousness and cultural norms that we are aware of. And so he thought that behavior was dictated by those mental processes that are operating below our level of usual awareness. And it's for that reason that he felt like psychology wasn't really a hard science, because he's a guy that came out of the realms of medicine. He did dissections on fish and stuff like that whenever he was in grad school, and he felt like, well, psychology is not really like that. You can't really slice open someone's brain and find mental processes, which, granted, at that time was true. But today, most of his theories aren't really practiced or, believed in any kind of meaningful way. He's more kind of seen as kind of a historical figure. So all of that crazy stuff that he said about sex, about how that he thought that women had penis envy, that all women wanted their own penis, or that men wanted to kill their fathers and elope with their mothers. I don't think many therapists you see today are going to believe any of that. But it depends. There is a fraction out there, psychoanalysts, who do kind of practice that kind of train of thought. It's just not very common. So even though a lot of his theories today have been discredited, at least as he kind of conceptualized them, he did introduce a lot of ideas that have stuck around and have been really useful. And one of the biggest of those is the idea of the unconscious, that we can have things that we are not necessarily aware of that might affect our behavior. And you can probably think of examples of this all on your own. I remember just a couple of days ago, I was really kind of grouchy and I didn't really understand why. And that might be, because there was something I wasn't aware of that was bothering me and I just couldn't name it. And later in that day I kind of figured out what it was, is that I was going to say I woke up on the wrong side of the bed, which is usually the kind of explanation for it. But it was literally because traffic. It was because traffic was really, really bad, and I felt like I was behind schedule, and because I felt like I was behind schedule, I felt like I wasn't caught up or prepared or organized, and it really kind of threw my day off a little bit. So that is an example of what we mean here about how something that is happening beneath our level of awareness might affect our behavior. He also developed what's called psychoanalysis, which is now kind of what people think of as like talk therapy, where you're sitting in a room talking with a therapist. And that obviously is still widely practiced today, just very, very differently than how he did it over 100 years ago. He also talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. We'll talk about that later this semester, but it's not really practiced in any kind of meaningful way. There's not really any kind of research to back that stuff up. The Oedipus complex I just talked about, the penis envy thing I talked about, theories about oral and anal fixations that people have as a product of their development. You probably heard these things before, but really a lot of those things haven't really stuck around. Really, unconsciousness has, psychoanalysis has, even though it's very different than how he thought of it, and also I would say defense mechanisms. Those are also another thing that he talked about that has really kind of stuck around, even if it is very different than how he kind of framed it. So let's talk about, he was around, he wrote lots of books, got very famous. People knew him in Europe and also in America, which again at this time is very, very young. This was right after the American Civil War. And so just think about how old that is, and the kinds of traditions and customs that Americans did back then, and how radical it might be that this guy from Europe is like, oh yeah, by the way, you behave this way because you're envious of penises, or you behave this way because you want to marry your mother, and you act this way because of whatever. You can understand, and dreams, obviously. He talked a lot about dream interpretation, which is not really something at all that's talked about in a meaningful way in psychology these days. But those made a huge impression across the world. People were very, very interested in psychology, and so it was just a decade or two after his prominence that people started testing this stuff like a science. And that brings us to Father Time, this guy right here. And sorry, I'm joking, that's not Father Time, that is this guy named Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt is a German guy, as you might expect, because I'm pronouncing his W's like V's. He established the very first psychology laboratory in Germany, in Leipzig. And he was interested in some really kind of fundamental questions about our human experience, which were perception and attention and rudimentary consciousness and stuff like that. And so he was interested in kind of these really small behaviors compared to Freud, who was writing books about dream interpretation and all this other cool stuff. So Wilhelm Wundt here, he created a laboratory in Europe, and from there, his students, people that trained with him, we had Americans move over to Europe for a few years, get their PhDs and this stuff, and then come back to America and develop their own laboratories in North America. And so we see it spread to Canada, we see it spread to the United States around the turn of the century in the late 1800s. And he developed this method of introspection, which was widely used at the time, but isn't really used these days, and we'll talk about what that is in a second. But first, I want to bring this kind of clash of ideas. I talked about structuralism versus functionalism, and here are the two guys that really kind of butt heads about this. We got Edward Titchener over here, this guy, and then we got William James over here. These are kind of, people see them as kind of like the grandfathers of American psychology, because they really had kind of the first two laboratories in the United States. This guy from Cornell, he's a New York guy, and then William James, he's a hometown lad. He's from, well, I say Boston. He worked at Harvard. I want to say he's from New England. I think he's from Boston, but I can't look it up right now. It doesn't really matter. But the point here is that these two guys really disagreed about the future of psychology and what kind of questions psychology should be asking. So let's take a quick look at Titchener. So Titchener believed that consciousness could be broken down into smaller components. And so we could understand the structure of consciousness, we can understand the structure of attention, and in so doing that, we might be able to understand how attention works. So he would be asking you a bunch of questions about your conscious experiences to help understand how do you perceive the world, because if you can understand how you perceive the world, then he might be able to understand how the mind works. And he used this using a method called introspection. And this is where you would essentially ask a bunch of questions about someone's experience. So if you see this image right here, and then I take it away, if I was Edward Titchener, then I might ask you a series of questions like, what did you see? What colors did you see? What shape did you see? Or what shapes did you see? Approximately how big were they? Which did you notice first, the color or the size? Which did you notice first, the shape on the outside or the shape on the inside? So asking a bunch of questions like that. And you can probably guess why that, so I don't know what happened to my text here. You can easily imagine why that would be a little bit problematic, that method, right? Because how can you be sure that your participant isn't mistaken? Maybe they're guessing, or maybe even they're lying. There would be no real way for me to verify that, right? And so for that reason, introspection kind of ticked off William James over here. William James didn't, I know it looks like they see eye to eye right now, but they didn't see eye to eye. Thank you, that was a very good joke. So what did William James believe? William James was he had a really bizarre kind of career path. He was a philosopher who came from a wealthy family. His brother is Henry James, who, I don't know if y'all know Henry James. I barely knew who Henry James was back whenever I was in college. He wrote the book The Turning of the Screw, which was adapted by Netflix into The Haunting of Bly Manor, I think is what it's called. So he's written a couple of stories you may have heard of before. That was his brother. And so at the time, William James thought that he was kind of a failed family member, that, his brother's great, his parents are rich, and he's just kind of hanging around, doesn't know what to do with his life. And ultimately, he kind of became fascinated in human behavior. And so he started a psychology laboratory over in Harvard and wrote what became known as the very first introduction to psychology textbook ever published in North America, called Principles of Psychology. So he argued, and he argued actually in his textbook that he wrote, he argued that the mind couldn't be frozen in time, that it's impossible for us to understand the mind because it's constantly changing, it's constantly adapting. That if we were to take a snapshot of the mind, that's okay, but by the time you do that, the mind has already changed. So the phrase stream of consciousness, this comes from William James, because he kind of compared consciousness to that of a river that is constantly moving, that maybe it slows down, maybe it speeds up, but it's always moving, and it's always changing. So he practiced the school of thought called functionalism, which is less interested in consciousness and more interested in why we do the things that we do. So if you, if you are an alcoholic, why are you an alcoholic? If you respond to your friends in a very sarcastic way, why do you do that? What purpose does that serve? What function does it serve? Because he believed, he was very much influenced by Charles Darwin, that, and I assume that y'all know Charles Darwin, who talked a lot about not just evolution, but natural selection, and about how, like, all these things about animals that exist, they exist for a reason. They exist for some kind of function that they have benefited the species. And he felt the same way about behavior, that we do the things that we do because they have helped us out in some way. They serve as some kind of function. So maybe I drink too much because I am working through something, or maybe I'm doing that because I'm trying to avoid something, or maybe I'm doing that because it's pleasurable and I don't find pleasure in other aspects of my life. Either way, this one thing that seemed to be destructive, this alcoholism, has served some kind of function. And if we know what function it is serving, then we can try to treat it. Then we can try to substitute it. Then we can try to change it. So that was William James's kind of perspective. So this was kind of one group of psychologists arguing that what behavior is and what consciousness is what's most important, and William James believing that why we do the things that we do is most important. And ultimately, as if I would have asked you, if I would have, called you up right now or emailed you and be like, yo, Becky, what do you think about Titchener versus James? Who you got? Most people are going to say that they like William James more because, again, he's interested in why we do the things that we do. So he thought that introspection was too subjective, that it was not reliable, that people could change their answers, or that they might not be truthful about their answers, or that they may be confused about their answers. And so for that reason, it's not a valid scientific process. And he argued that if psychology is going to be a science, that it needs to be more objective, it needs to be more reliable, it needs to be something that you can see, something that you can directly measure. So this is all just to say that part of the reason why psychology is so interested in research and so interested in observable behaviors and why we do the things that we do is because of William James. It's because of this early debate that psychologists had, and that this side was seen as more persuasive in completing the goals of psychology. I'm going to pause it here. So if you have, and I think we have about another 30 minutes. I apologize. I said this was going to take about an hour, and I was mistaken about that. But we're kind of getting on our way out of this. But I think we'll need about 30 minutes. So this is a good place to take a break and come back in just a couple of minutes when we feel rested, and we can finish up this chapter. Okay, sorry about that. Welcome back, and now we are into our final third of the video. Sorry about that. So we're picking up by where we left off, talking about functionalism and how functionalism is all about how we should think about why we do the things that we do. And this was William James kind of leading that, that movement. One of the many interesting things about William James is that he actually kind of retired early because he felt like he was done with psychology, where not that he had completed it, but rather that he had kind of gotten to this point where he was like, look, I don't know, like, it's complicated, I'm never going to understand this stuff, so I'm going to pivot. And he pivoted to philosophy and theology. He actually, one of the textbooks that he wrote called The Varieties of Religious Experience is considered like a hallmark of theological teaching. Really, really fascinating stuff. But, so he's leaving the movement, right? And in his place, there's kind of a power vacuum now. Who's going to be, the leader of this movement? Long story short, we're gonna talk about this guy here now, John Watson. And I know this image makes him look kind of like a villain, makes him look kind of like a creeper, and that's okay because historically he does have a little bit of a villainous reputation. So John Watson kind of came in with this wave of functionalism, and he really kind of helped radicalize it. And what I mean by that is that John Watson is very much like an empiricist first. In other words, if you can't see it, if you can't measure it, he's not really all that interested in it. So things like consciousness, things like mental processes, things like internal emotions, John Watson's not very interested in that kind of thing because you can't directly see that stuff. You can't directly measure it. And so he developed behaviorism, or what we call behaviorism now, which is that we focus on the observable stimuli that we can see and how that affects your behavior. And this was coming up around the same time as Pavlov, who I'm sure you've heard of, Pavlov and his dogs. We'll talk a lot about that in chapter 6, I believe. And so John Watson is kind of thinking about that as he's kind of taking this lead, about how like so much of our behavior can be explained through conditioning and associative learning and pairing stimuli together. And so he believed that all behaviors are learned, that who you are as a person is because of the life you have led and the experiences you have had. Which on one hand, whenever you think about it that way, behaviorism is very, for its time, radical in a way because it argued that everybody is equal at birth, that basically men, women, white, black, whatever the differences that might on surface level be different between us, that ultimately we're all born individually blank, and that we become who we are. We develop our personalities based on the experiences that we have. That's very much a kind of behaviorist way of thinking about this. He got, he became very famous, and one of his kind of famous challenges is this quote that I love: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief." Hey, you see that rhyme he's got going there? Regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. And so you can already see he's using a little bit of sexist language here by talking about guys only. But the point that he's making here is that if you have a dozen infants and you give this man the power to oversee their environment and what kinds of things they are exposed to, and what kind of school and teachings they have, and what kind of things that they read, and what kind of sports they participate in at school, that he can mold them into any kind of specialist you want. And that's because every person who is born, it doesn't matter what kind of talents you have, it doesn't matter what kind of penchants or tendencies or abilities you think you might have, or jobs that your parents had, or whatever your race of your ancestors is, doesn't matter. What really matters is this idea of a specified world, that who we become is because of the worlds that we live in. So we'll talk more about John Watson later in the semester, because like I said, he's a very interesting figure. He didn't last too long though, because he ultimately got kicked out of psychology, or kicked out of academia, I should say, for I'm not going to say what it is, because I'll tell you later in the semester, and I'll leave that as a little bit of a cliffhanger. Moving on, it's a good story though, or an interesting story, not a good story. But after John Watson left the field, B.F. Skinner, a name you've probably heard before, took up the mantle of behaviorism, and B.F. Skinner is the dude rocks. I love B.F. Skinner, even though I'm not somebody who typically likes behaviorism, or I should say the classes that I teach are not really behaviorist at all. I deeply admire B.F. Skinner. I think he rules. There's a lot of misinformation around about him, like an urban legend, which is that he raised his daughter in a cage, which is not true, but people like to kind of rumor about that because of the way that he worked so much with animals, and they just assumed that he trained his daughter the same way that he would train a pigeon or a rat in one of his chambers. What we call operant chambers, or Skinner box. If you've ever heard of a Skinner box, that's what that's referring to. We'll do another deep dive on B.F. Skinner when we talk about learning later in the semester. But basically, B.F. Skinner's whole contribution to the field is what we now call operant conditioning, and this idea that your behavior is shaped by the consequences of your actions. And that includes even internal processes like thoughts and emotion and internal language, things that you can't directly see or measure. He argues that those types of behaviors, even if you can't see them, are still subjected to the same laws as outward behaviors. And so he's essentially arguing that if we're talking about the example that I gave earlier about how, like, if I were to answer all of your questions with a really snide, sarcastic remark, you'd probably stop asking questions, right? And that's to B.F. Skinner's point here, is that the things that you do is shaped by the consequences that follow those behaviors. And I know this seems totally obvious. It seems like total common sense. But he would go on to show this scientifically in a laboratory, that this is not just true for people, but it's also true for non-humans too. Something as simple as a pigeon, as complicated as a monkey, or as complicated as a person, I should say. But he also felt like we didn't really need mental processes to explain how behavior works. You can just simply point at this thing happened in the environment, the organism did this behavior, and this was the outcome. And that is why they did that. Why is it that you, we were talking about alcoholism as like an example of like understanding why, what is the function of that behavior? What B.F. Skinner is saying here is that it doesn't necessarily matter for someone who has alcoholism for what they necessarily tell you why they are an alcoholic, but instead matters is looking at their environment, what happens as a consequence of that alcoholism. What is it that they are being rewarded for in this? Maybe it's a break from reality, maybe it's something else like that, a dopamine rush or serotonin or whatever. Basically, he's saying that what we need to focus on is the things that we can directly see, and how the environment either rewards us or punishes us for our actions. He wrote a book that was super controversial called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, where essentially he argued that that there was not really any such thing as free will, and that what we do is kind of behave as a response to our environments. Really fascinating, interesting stuff, and unfortunately really complex and nuanced, more than I can kind of talk about in the 20 minutes that I have left here. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, check it out on Wikipedia. It's a cool read, cool interesting read. This is going on, from the 50s up into the late 60s or so, and behaviorism really dominated psychology, or I should say, from John Watson's time in the 30s to the 60s. Behaviorism was kind of the top thing in psychology. So if you were to take a psychology major, if you were to be a psychology major in this time, you'd be learning about B.F. Skinner 24/7 pretty much. You still learn about Freud too, but not nearly as much as you would Watson and Skinner and their teachings. Now today it's much more diverse, where you have a couple of classes where you really focus in on Skinner, like applied behavior analysis, learning, maybe some of the counseling classes, but for the most part they're not nearly as dominant as they used to be. While this was all going on, over in Europe, there was a field called Gestalt psychology that was developing, and America, doing what America does best, which is ignore what's going on in Europe, didn't really travel over to America until the 60s. And Gestalt psychology kind of came around in the 1910s, and the idea behind this, kind of the theory behind Gestalt psychology, is that consciousness and experience and personality, these are all things that are that are greater than the sum of their parts. What does that mean? Basically, it means that if I were to give you a personality test, you took the personality test, and then I get, your results, and then I get a machine where I can make a robot, and I put those personality traits into the robot's not going to act exactly like you, right? Because there's something about you that is more than just the results of a personality test. And they would also argue that, that's true for your perception, that's true for your consciousness, it's true for a lot of different things about the human experience. And again, comes back to this idea that so much of our perception relies on the context in which we experience that environment or those people or whatever. So here is an example of Gestalt psychology at work, if you'll humor me for just a second. What is this image right here? If you're looking at this image, what on earth is it? I'll give you a second to look at it and to try to make your guess. What about this? Now that I've revealed more of this image, can you tell what it is? So think about, what is it that I am showing you here? I'm going to zoom out a little bit more. Do you see it now? Usually when I'm in the classroom, people will kind of recognize maybe what it is. And it's also kind of easy, well, not necessarily kind of easy, but it helps that it is a Dalmatian. So it is a dog that has white and black spots. If you don't see the dog that has white and black spots, let me outline right here. Oops. All right. So what are we looking at here? Basically, we're looking at a dog who is walking through a park, sniffing some things. You can see the shadow from a tree that comes up right here. You can see the dog with his ear, his snout right there. You got a collar on. He's sniffing the ground. His head's angled down. You can see his shoulder up here, the back, his tail, and then his two legs, two back legs, two front legs, so on and so forth. Now, if I were to go back and just show you this, do you see the dog? Yes, you do. And that is Gestalt psychology's point, that what you're seeing here is greater than just the stimulus in front of you. What your mind is able to do is to now see the lines and edges and the contours of this dog, even though there's not really a picture of a dog on this image. It's just really a series of white and black blobs. And yet, because we have identified it earlier, and I'll erase this just to make it, yeah. So now you see, now you see the dog. Now, if I were to show you this tomorrow, just show you this image right here, you'd say it was a dog. But if I were to show this image to somebody who's never seen it before, they see this entire image, they won't know what exactly to say. They won't know what they're looking at. If you don't believe me, you can try it out on a friend. Call them into your dorm room and say, "What is this?" and see how well they do. All right, so I mentioned cognitive psychology a little bit because behaviorism really kind of dominated American psychology until about the 60s, and that mostly changed with something called information processing theory. I know it sounds very, very boring, but information processing theory is this shift in the way that we think about data and the way that we think about matter that is going to go and influence biology, physics, chemistry, computer science, and psychology, along with other fields too, I'm sure. Communications, especially communications. If you've taken a communications class, you probably learned about, what is it called? Like the sender message channel receiver. That if you've ever heard about that, that's all information processing theory. If you took COM 101 as part of your core curriculum. Information processing theory started developing because of people thinking about how to communicate things using technology. And so it's used a lot in computing, and so people started thinking about how the brain operates a little bit like a computer and vice versa. If you've ever wondered why is it that biologists talk about genes as genetic information, why they use information there, it's because of information processing theories, because every science was influenced by this in the mid-1900s. So basically, cognitive psychology showed that there are lots of things that that humans go through that can't be explained through simple laws of behaviorism. And one of the most famous examples of this comes from George Miller, who in the 50s gave a lecture about what we now know as short-term memory, and basically showed that we all have a capacity, we all have a limit to our memory, and that doesn't matter what you've been associated. Like, it doesn't matter about your conditioning, it doesn't matter about your training, that everybody kind of has a limit on their short-term memory that you can't directly see. I can't see your short-term memory, but I can get inferences from it by giving you a series of memory tests, and then I might be able to find your limitations for how good your short-term memory is. For most people, by the way, that's 7 plus or minus 2 stimuli, which is why, like, for example, you can remember a phone number because it is, it fits in here, in the series of numbers, that you remember between 5 and 9 things. So whenever you talk about a phone number, if the phone number you're thinking of is this, please don't call this number, by the way, because it is a family member's. If I were to give you this number, how do you store it in your memory? You're going to break this up into 3 chunks, right? Usually like this. You do the first 3, the second 3, and then you take the last 4 and you break it up into 2. So you, instead of saying 91233412880, you would say 91233412880, right? So that way, all you have to really remember is 4 things, because you're only remembering 4 numbers now. I'm remembering 912, 334, 12, and 80. That's 4 numbers instead of 10, because 10 would be beyond our capacity of 7 items plus or minus 2. I should put a minus there. All right, and then we'll talk more about that later in the semester as well. In the 80s, cognitive psychologists like George Miller would join forces with neuroscientists, computer scientists, and philosophers to develop what we now call cognitive neuroscience. And cognitive neuroscience is kind of a dominant way that people talk about behavior now. We kind of integrate behavior, cognitive processes, and brain activation to try to explain and describe human behavior. All right, so that's kind of the quick history of all this stuff. Well, quick to me, maybe not so quick to you. The reason why we're going to be focusing on research is because psychologists use research to fuel therapy, to help make therapy better for everyone, and then what we experience as therapists we can then study using research to try to make therapy even better. So in psychology, research is going to improve therapy, and therapy is going to help us identify new areas of study that we can do research in. And so behaviorism really kind of gave rise to lots of different therapy styles that were designed to modify outward behaviors. So for example, an outward behavior like a phobia. So if you were really, really afraid of spiders, then what a behaviorist would say is, like, it doesn't matter what you think about spiders. Me telling you that spiders are safe is not going to make you all of a sudden unafraid of spiders. Instead, what we can do is we can and it's going to sound mean, I can expose you to spiders. I can it's called exposure therapy, and so I'm trying to think of another word besides expose, but I can introduce spiders into your environment in a safe way, bring them closer and closer to you, and you're going to freak out, you're going to be unhappy, you're going to hate this because you have a phobia of it. But what happens is that your body is going to learn these spiders are not deathly serious, they're not deathly dangerous, and your body's going to learn this isn't something that I should be super afraid about. This is an okay thing. This is something that I can be in the same room as and not run out of it screaming. Aaron Beck is kind of a leading figure in what we now know as cognitive behavioral therapy, where he helped identify taking some of these behavior modification ideas, like prolonged exposure therapy, and then marrying those with how can we get people to, if they have a faulty cognition, like, for example, I see that spider and I think that it's going to jump across the room, land on me, bite me, and kill me. That's an irrational thought. Spiders can't do that. Beck basically tried to design ways that we can measure this, and that we can evaluate it, and that we can treat it. So he is really a great example of somebody who did therapy and did research together to try to make therapy stronger using research. Social psychology, we'll talk more about that at the end of the semester pretty much. It's a later chapter, but social psychology is the idea that people around us affect our behavior. The most popular psychological experiments, a lot of them are social psychology experiments. If you've ever heard of the Zimbardo prison experiment or the Stanford prison experiment, that is an example of social psychology. If you've ever heard of the Bobo doll study, where they had children watch an adult beat up on a clown doll and then watch their reactions to playing with the clown doll, that is also social psychology. If you've ever heard of the Milgram obedience studies, those are also social psychology. The Kitty Genovese event with the bystander effect, that's all social psychology. A lot of fun, cool things that leak out into pop culture come from social psychology. But the idea is that we can understand how we view ourselves and how we view others and how others influence our behavior. Psychology today, as I mentioned, is mostly a blend of all these things, actually. In our department, for example, I'm a cognitive psychologist. The person that their office is next to me, Dr. Shelley, she is a developmental psychologist. The person across the office from her is an evolutionary psychologist. We got a clinical psychologist. We got a forensic psychologist. We got a couple of behavioral psychologists. A couple of other developmental psychologists. We have a cognitive neuroscientist. Somebody, or I think she would say that she's more of a behavioral neuroscientist. But somebody who studies fruit fly behavior in the laboratory on campus. So the status of psychology today is very diverse. There's lots of different schools of thought, and they all kind of work together and feed into into each other to help us explain different things. If I'm trying to explain how criminals behave, I probably can't do a great job of that, but forensic psychology can. Whereas forensic psychology probably can't tell us all that much about memory and attention, but cognitive psychology can. So you see what I mean? It really depends on what kinds of questions about behavior you are asking. Cognitive neuroscience just emphasizes how very diverse the field is, because we will collaborate with biologists, neuroscientists, physicists, engineers to help us understand how the brain works. So anytime you see any kind of study that has brain activation like this, where you see slices of the brain and these hot spots of activation, that's cognitive neuroscience. The brain is super complicated, and even though we have smartphones, we got cars that drive on pure electricity or whatever fancy technology you can think of at the moment, we still don't really understand the brain all that well. It is super complicated. There have been previous efforts from the scientific community to really try to push ourselves to understand the brain. Probably one of the most famous versions of this was back in the 2010s, where Barack Obama really tried to spearhead something called the Brain Initiative, which most people don't really know about, just because the nature of politics and presidents today is that nobody really cares about the actual policies. It's all about the personalities and all about, the whatever. So most people don't even know that the Brain Initiative existed, but basically that was a change in the way that psychology and biology are funded, where you get a better chance at receiving a grant, at receiving a scholarship, at receiving money, if you have something about your research tied to understanding how the brain works and the biology underpinning that. And that's coming from the National Institute of Mental Health, along with the National Science Foundation, and along with the National Institute of Health. All right, there are other subfields of psychology. I already mentioned some of those. Oh, I forgot to mention sports psychologists. We have a sports psychologist in our staff. We have a health psychologist in our staff as well. And that is all they have time for. I am so sorry that this video went on so long. The other videos are not going to be nearly this long, but we had a lot to cover in our first chapter to kind of give you an overview of the field and where it came from. And Hopefully it wasn't too dreadfully boring, but like I said, Chapter 1 is the least exciting chapter in my opinion, or the chapter that most students are kind of iffy on, that they don't like as much as the others. So if you made it this far, cool. You made it through the most boring part of the semester, I think. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you later. Bye-bye, everybody.